Well, welcome back to another episode of The Leader Within. Today, I get to introduce Salima Stanley-Bhanji. She has spent almost 15 years in leadership roles within the nonprofit sector, including serving as the executive director of Vibrant Calgary. In 2015, Salima co-founded Humainologie, a Canadian not-for-profit that aims to center people facing systemic barriers by amplifying their stories through films and celebrating their humanity. Through her work at Humainologie, Salima has produced and directed numerous short films, many of which has received over 20 international awards and film festival selections. With Salima's passion for diverse and authentic representation and her dynamic background in law, entrepreneurship, making award-winning films, serving on a board, and her leadership experience, I'm excited to have her share her insights with you. Well, welcome, Salima. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you discovered your passion or your niche?
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm if I'm looking over that way, it's because like my new kitten is just like perched by the window with her ears up, and so yeah, just like I'm like I am here, but like what's she doing next? Yeah, so I think that I'm still really finding my passion and my niche. It's like an evolving thing. I don't feel like there's ever an arrival point, and actually for me, that's the good news because I think otherwise life could start to feel a little bit dull or boring. And with time, the feeling on my end is that there's just this unfolding that brings me closer and closer to the thing that I'm supposed to be doing at that moment in time. And when I look back on all of the things, and there are quite a lot of very different things, some of which don't necessarily seem to kind of jive together. It's like, oh, I'm doing this and I'm doing that over here and this thing over here. But somehow miraculously over time, just by following those whims that I've had, a lot of those things have begun to converge. And that's a really amazing thing to see that, oh, that little workshop I did like 15 years ago is now helpful in this moment with this project I'm doing over here. Or so, so I really don't ascribe to that, everything happens for a reason. Like it's not part of my innate philosophy, but I do feel that there is this sense of like, bringing you towards the things that are in alignment with like what you're supposed to offer when you're here on this earth. Sounds a little cliche, but yeah, so and I feel fortunate to have that opportunity to be able to be on that path and doing the work that I do, and storytelling is a big part of my passion, and being able to share other people's stories and illuminate who they are and share that with other people.
Hey, you know what? I really appreciate your authenticity, especially from like society's perspective, and even from a visible minority's perspective. Like, you have a legal background, you have a business. Like, every Asian parent would be proud to have a kid like you, essentially. But the most important thing is that you're very authentic about the fact that it's like, hey, like, you know what? It's a mix of different things that brought me to where I am today. I'm still figuring things out as I go, because there's just like, life is dynamic, right? It's not just a thing where we live in a vacuum box kind of thing. So I like I said, I really appreciate that you're like, hey, like, you know what? I'm still figuring it out and it's all coming together. So I guess from your perspective, based on the leaders you've encountered in your career, what are some attributes of leaders who have really helped with the trajectory of your success? Whether it's a good attribute or one where you're like, man, I never, ever want to be like that individual.
Yeah, I like that you added that in there, because I think so often when we think of like who are our mentors, who are the people that we've looked up to and that have helped us come to where we're at, very often we just look at it in a one-sided way with respect to the people who have, you know, been positive role models in our lives. But so often, like, all kinds of examples that we observe are really helpful in determining who we want to be in the world. And for me, most of the people I observe are the people that are closely connected to me, and not really like people out there, or even like in the business community, or celebrities. They're just, my friends, my family, my daughter, and I'm constantly observing the things that they say, the things that they do, the ways they interact with other people. And that maybe sounds sort of like I'm constantly judging. It's not really that. It's more so just as we're taking in all of this information, going about being in the world, it really helps us to be able to figure out how we want to be in the world. And an example would be like when I see my daughter super excited and in awe about something that I feel like is kind of like boring or just like commonplace, it reminds me, right, of that sort of lost magic in seeing the world that she has, that freshness. And I would take that example from her, and kind of like attempt to bring a little bit of that magic that she has in her perspective into mine. So really it's just like the day-to-day moments like that, right, that are for me very much like have continue to cultivate in an ongoing way. And I think in moments where I have sought like someone or something very external to me, that has tended to kind of like backfire, and it almost is just like, you know what, everything's right here, everything is with you, and you just need to be open to see it and receive it.
I can appreciate that because being around a lot of kids in jujitsu, so I practice martial arts on the side, and just seeing the way that they engage with one another, how they problem solve, especially when their parents don't just like jump in all the time and they figure it out, and how they also engage with each other from like a formal respect perspective versus just like whatever. Maybe I'm like, you can actually learn a lot by just taking a step back, and you can learn from everyone for that matter, right? So yeah, I definitely appreciate your observation, because I'm kind of similar where I'm like, I'm not judging, I'm just learning, right? And I guess when you spoke a little bit about that openness and just seeing how things can kind of tie into each other, I know that you have a legal background. And then how have you translated that into filmmaking, specifically capturing stories in a way where you can move people and kind of shed light on just some of the issues that you kind of are passionate about?
Yeah, I think recently a friend of mine who's also partaking in one of our projects had asked me to come along to their interview, just to kind of be a backup on some of the questions. And they shared it in such a way where they were like almost suggesting that, like, my lawyer kind of thing is like what allows me to like ask all the questions. And I do think there is a connection there, because there is like a comprehensiveness that you need to have as a lawyer, especially in litigation, which was, where I started out in my legal career, to be able to, really have an understanding for like what needs to be asked next, and to not necessarily just stick to your cheat sheet, but to be able to maneuver in the conversation and understand what makes sense, where to go next, and what information you need to find out. And obviously it's really different in a legal context versus this very human context, which can sometimes be extremely vulnerable and personal. But there's some crossover for sure. On a more like administrative day-to-day basis, I'm like doing contracts for like, employees and contractors and things like that. And there are skills that were developed in that realm that I'm really grateful that, I know what, how to navigate certain things. But ultimately, I think that whole program really was a lot about transferable skills and just analyzing a situation and considering different perspectives and different, I mean, in the legal sense, you might call it arguments, but, but yeah, I think that since that time in my life, because it was a while ago that I went to law school, I definitely feel like some of that analytical reasoning and stuff has dulled a little bit from what it used to be. And I'm also grateful for that as well, because I think to a certain extent, that sharpness, that intellectual sharpness, can take away from like human connection. because you're always analyzing and because you're just, so kind of committed to the exact meaning of each word. And there's a lot of gray space in human interaction. And so I'm actually a little bit grateful that there is a little bit of like more softness that has come in that allows me to experience other people just in a slightly more nuanced, gray, soft, whatever, however you want to describe that way than when I was younger. And I was like really sort of, very much integrated into that way of thinking.
And speaking of that human connection piece, I know asking those great questions to lead to those great stories being told does not come naturally to people. But I believe that it is actually one of the most important skills as a leader, right? Because when you can connect on a human level, especially when people are spending so much time with you, what's a tip that you can provide to a leader to ask great questions and really connect on that human level?
I 100% agree with you that some of the most critical skills just as a human, period. And then, of course, the more authority you're given as a human and the more impact you have on other people, then the more important it becomes, right? That you have these skills so that all of the people that you come into contact with are impacted by you in a good way, right? So, and for me, yeah, listening is so key. And also, with listening, there is a level of intuiting, right? Because the words say, a certain amount of information, but people's body language and how they express their tone, all of those things, really tell us more. And I think that there's a lot of information that we receive when we're not just listening to the words. So I think just listening and providing space for people to express, and that's actually one thing by doing this work that I have realized when we are, doing an interview that we're filming, and most of our work, we edit out the interviewer's voice. So if I'm asking a question, that would be edited out of the final film. And because of that, when I'm talking to someone like in real time, I'm usually like, and then what? And there's a lot of interjection. And when I'm actually interviewing for a film, I'm very silent. And of course, I do nod a lot and encourage people and validate people with my facial expressions, but I don't interject. And so a lot of space is given. And I find almost that something quite magical happens when you give someone that amount of space to really share. And so, yeah, I think giving people space, really authentically listening, and then, not having the thing you want to say or ask ready or thinking about it as they're expressing, which sometimes we do and it's inevitable, but ultimately trying to really be present with them in the conversation. And then when there is that moment, to be able to speak or ask something further, you're right there and you're asking the right thing in that moment, not the right thing for 2 minutes before or earlier when you prepped for the conversation. So, and I think that those are skills that seem basic in some ways, but they're actually very nuanced and can be difficult, especially when we're having more difficult conversations with people. And that is oftentimes different perspectives or challenging things we need to communicate. That's often when that skill set can really be challenged and sometimes fall apart. And I think we see that in our intimate relationships, where it's I don't agree with you and I can't believe you think that. And then, it just becomes quite polarized. And I think that space that we're willing to give to the other person shrinks down, and then they feel that and they react to that. And anyway, so yeah, I mean, that's a whole other topic and podcast, hey, but I do agree with you that just that simple skill of listening, asking questions, being present in the conversation with another person, and actually truly caring, if that's possible, right? Sometimes it might be hard to, but if we're actually truly earnest and genuine in being in that conversation with someone, I think that's felt and received, and that also changes the feeling of an interaction and the relationship with the other person. And boy, I had a lot to say on that.
And I appreciate that because, like you said, there's so many nuances. It's not a simple concept, and that's why not everyone is good at this skill. And I think one question that just came to mind as you were chatting is like, you can have great intentions of being like, hey, like, I want to create a judgment free zone so that you can speak openly and vulnerably in this situation. But then there's other physical cues that might indicate otherwise, right? So, is there something that you've noticed, or is it the whole traditional psychology where if you cross your arms and then it's like your face is scrunched up, like those are some of the physical cues that might like contradict what you're trying to say? So yeah, just kind of curious from that perspective for you.
Yeah, I think awareness of like, how we are responding and what we might look like to the other person is a good thing without getting overly self-conscious about it, but I also think that if we're not sure what to say, sometimes we end up feeling like we have to say something and then saying the wrong thing. And I think sometimes it's okay just to wait and to have a silence to see if the other person is going to continue or wants to fill that silence. And if we still don't know what to say and that silence is hanging, to even just say, wow, like, thanks for sharing. I actually don't know what to say right now, like, I think it's okay to be honest and rather than to sort of fumble and misstep and potentially, close the other person off to us by saying something that isn't quite the right thing. I, I would say that, one of the other kinds of like errors that we can make is by bringing too much of ourselves into a conversation, especially if it's something that we can relate to, and jumping in too soon with the, oh yeah, I went through that as well, or and then somehow someone wanted to share something, and then we made it about ourselves. And maybe the similar situation we had was similar, but it was also very different. And so I think there are just so many ways that we can make people feel like we actually didn't hear them or we're not totally getting it. And so sometimes like less talking is actually more powerful, than that sort of like desire we have to share back and to interject. So I think that's important too. But, these are like lifelong kinds of like skills that it does become harder as we get older, right, to change our habits, but it is possible. And even with my daughter, like I'll hear her, sometimes she chats to her grandma on FaceTime, and her grandma's so good at like asking her a million questions. And my daughter doesn't reciprocate that while she's 5. And so I'm very often saying to her, what did you ask Granny? Like, have you, is there a question you can ask Granny? Because I think a big part of like relationship is like reciprocating curiosity and care through asking questions and listening.
You shed perspective on both sides of it, right? It was that self-awareness piece of like, well, when does trying to relate too much to the other person take away from the conversation itself? Which I often see, right? It's like out of good intention, but then there's like, all right, cool. It's about you again, right? Even though like I came to you wanting to share X, Y, and Z. So I appreciate that piece and just that curiosity, right? That you called out there. And I guess one of the biggest gifts that you have is just self-awareness and self-insight, right? And really helping others through that as well. So can you talk about how you continue to develop those two muscles? So again, self-insight and awareness so that it helps you in your success.
I think that there probably some element of that tendency towards like sort of looking within is something that is part of our nature versus nurture. Like some people are just more oriented that way than others. And one of the dangers of being oriented that way and constantly kind of, looking inside, going inside, can be that there's a lot going on up here, and that the things going on up here can tend towards criticism. Like an example of this would be, because we've been talking about communication, you have a conversation or after this podcast, oh, and then you're going back over the conversation and analyzing it and what I did say, what I could have said, what I should have said, blah, blah, blah. And a lot of energy is expended in that process. And it's not necessarily like helpful or constructive. So, there are different ways that we can have insight and look within. And maybe sometimes the tendencies that we have in terms of the ways that we do look within, maybe those could also, be examined themselves, right? Like, I think, and I think I went through a period of my life where I did like silent meditation retreats, like for 7 days, and a lot of introspective kinds of like Eastern spiritual practices. And there was definitely like a real kind of striving towards like understanding like who am I and why am I here, and why am I this way, why did these things happen in my relationships, like why, really kind of just trying to like come to terms with like who I am in this world. And that was a lot of like what happened, I would say, in my 30s. And I think it was really important for me to spend all that time just like, and a lot of it was solitary time too, right? Because it's hard to do that work if you're constantly in connection with others and socializing and busy. And so there was a lot of solitary time. And I think that, those kind of practices and that orientation definitely provided me with a level of comfortability, being able to stop and be silent and not have things go on and not be distracted, and to come into myself and see what's going on. So I'm really grateful for that. But I also think there came a point where there was maybe just an understanding of a greater level of acceptance of things how they are. And that reduced the necessity to keep kind of going back in there and churning it all around. And so I suppose that I think at different times in our lives, I think there are different seasons and different ways that, we might orient ourselves. And that's wonderful. And we should, follow that. I think as far as our relationships with other people and leadership, I think it's always important to have a level of reflecting back, even in the moment, of what we're saying and how it's being perceived in order to be truly effective communicators. But I think when we get to a point where we're doing that too much, then it could be said that we're adjusting our behaviors or who we are for other people. Kitten is down in like a paper bag right now. So you hear some rustling. It's like, it sounds bad, right? That she's in a paper bag, but she's going there by choice. It's like, it's a fun place for her. We kept it out for that reason. Anyhow, yeah, I think that, there's there's always like moderation, right, in the application of things. And for sure, if we get too immersed in that inner world and are constantly questioning it or questioning it too much, it can also take us away from being present with the other person, right? So there's, I think, an amount of it, right, as we're conversing, you're like gauging the other person, considering how you're going to say something, but then too much of it, and it takes us out of actually being able to be present and receive what the other person's sharing. So man, it's a tricky area to navigate, but I think that it's so important, like I feel like, honestly, I feel like the fate of like our world relies upon our ability to communicate with each other and to be able to provide enough space for difference, and also like a willingness to just like receive others with their differences, like that to me, those are the things that, like, if we can do that, maybe we, can kind of make it, right? Like, there's conflict happening at the moment, in many places in the world. And as much as it seems like it's sort of national and international and, not something that can be solved by an individual, we as individuals make up the world, right? And if we do this all a little bit differently, then, those things on the macro level should shift as also.
Well, thank you for a lot of like golden nuggets there, because one of the things that I think that resonated with me that you mentioned earlier is the whole vicious feedback loop that we can get into, right? So I agree with you that it's really important to create the space and have that self-reflection piece, because that's why this podcast is called The Leader Within, because I believe leadership is a two-way street. You got to lead yourself in order to better lead others. But then there comes a time where if you do it too much, you become a martyr and you actually overlook what actually the root or the core issue is, right, in that situation. So, and then the latter piece that you touch on is just creating the space for the differences. And I think that's one of the beautiful things that you do through your work in filmmaking, is you're highlighting a lot of these different stories. So based on all the films that you've made through Humainologie, what is one key takeaway that you can offer business leaders so that they can effectively lead through change while embracing the differences?
Ooh, I gotta keep it down to one key thing. Yeah, there's definitely more than one. But, connecting back to our prior conversations around self-awareness, and kind of, looking within, I think that we all have inherent biases, and we're all conditioned, in ways that are very often connected to how we were raised and our experiences as young people in the world, and what we were exposed to, what we weren't exposed to. And those things create maybe even just levels of comfort, or levels of like ignorance around things. And so being aware, right, of where we may be uncomfortable, being aware of where we may have existing biases, judgments, where we might hold attitudes that could be considered to be discriminatory or racist. Because even as, for me as a woman of color, right, like I have grown up in like a colonized environment and system, right, that valued whiteness. And so that information was like delivered to me through so many different means as a very young person, right? I ingested that information. And so for me to assume that now, even so many years later, that all of that information that I received at such an early age has been fully eradicated from me, I think that would be, maybe just a tall expectation. So, so to have, awareness, right, of the system that we've grown up with, and the conditioning, all of that, so that, when we are relating with people or considering different issues, in a workplace or just generally in life, that we can have the confidence and comfortability with ourselves to witness those things coming up. And those are things sometimes that it can be hard to see about yourself, right? It can be like uncomfortable because you don't like what you see. And so, for me, I would say the recognition that it's not my fault that this is part of me. It's not my fault, right? Like I was not responsible for creating this conditioning, but I am responsible now for like how this conditioning could affect me and other people around me. And so that's where I have the opportunity. And sometimes that opportunity exists in just becoming aware that that thing is there. Sometimes that's all that's needed. Other times it might be more than that, but sometimes just that awareness, right, is enough to be able to then navigate a situation better. I think one of the huge challenges and real kinds of like sticky situations are when we encounter leaders who are like, I don't see color, and but my wife is black, or but my best friend is indigenous, or whatever, like some of those types of ways of seeing and expressing are problematic. and they become amplified in how problematic they are when people are in positions of authority and are impacting so many other people, including people who identify in those ways and are living that experience firsthand. So the more kind of power and authority that we have, the more ability we have to impact other people, the more that these skills are just so important. And the more that we can claim the places where we, have blinders on, or where we are reactive, or where we have, problematic conditioning, because we're human and we do, then the more we can actually create like spaces and organizations that are safer for people and healthier for people.
Thank you for sharing your insight, because you touched on two things that kind of made me, well, I rolled my eyes for those who can't see your video podcast and are listening to the audio form. When you said some leaders who say, I don't see color, because I'm like, did you have your eyes closed? Because like, what do you mean by you don't see color, for one? And secondly, is there's a lot of leaders who, especially those with privilege, that say, I just don't understand. And then they stop the conversation there. They don't even say, I don't understand, help me understand blank, right? And in a curious way, right? And it goes back to our theme of that awareness and curiosity piece, so that you're not taking away from the lived experience of others. So I guess as we slowly wrap up our conversation, one of my questions to you is, what do you think it takes to unleash the potential of an individual or an organization?
For me, a big theme with the work that I do, and something that I truly care about and feel is so critically important, is just that people get to be the most authentic version of themselves, and that they are able to live in an authentic way, and they're able to be embraced and valued as their authentic selves. And there are a lot of institutions and organizations that make it really hard for people to do that. So how do we create a culture that allows people to feel comfortable, supported, and valued being who they are? And to me, that is, even inside a family or inside a relationship of just two people, right? Like, if you feel like I can be myself, I can truly be myself, I can show who I am, and I am appreciated and loved for it, then we like thrive under those conditions, right? And we want to do our best for the other person or for the company or whatever we work for, right? Because we truly feel a sense of belonging and appreciation and a sense of like acceptance. I hate to think of the sense of like, let's do it because it's good for business, but it is good for business, right? Like, that is the reality of it. I would rather that we do it because like it's just like human, like a human centered way of like existing in this world, and and it just feels right and feels good to interact with each other that way. But if that isn't going to be the way that makes that happen in some contexts, then remembering that like people give when they feel good, right? And so so to me, that's like the key thing. And it's a hard thing, right? Especially when today there are people who are inhabiting really complex identities with so many multiple intersections. And that is the stuff that like excites me. I feel like it's so beautiful and so rich and interesting, but it's also the stuff that for a lot of people can like scare them to death, because it's like, well, I don't know how to speak to someone who identifies as this or that, as like neurodiverse, or as non-binary, or as trans, or and instead of like doing the work and also being humble about what you might not know, right? Like, and being open about that, I think people just sort of develop fear and shy away from those things, and that creates a lot of challenge and issues and doesn't make people inhabiting these identities feel included, feel accepted, feel valued. So I think there's work to do, and that is part of the work that we do, is to share these different expressions of like identities and of life, and so that there are less kind of like barriers between people occupying different identities.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that question and also for the work that you're doing through Humainologie, because when you talked about the whole, there's a lot of fear, anxiety, whatever word you want to use when it comes to trying to interact with individuals who, like you said, have very complex intersectionalities. I think the work that you do creates a space to have a safe conversation, because generally people who do share those stories are the ones that then invite conversations of, okay, like I know who to go to be able to now ask questions and better understand, right? And final question for you is, what is one thing that you're working on that you are super excited about?
One of the projects that Humainologie has been working on for like several years now is called Shades, Amplify Her Voice. It's a platform for Black, Brown, and Asian women in Calgary, and it's really very much about amplifying, their contributions, celebrating them, and sharing their stories. Part of that platform also includes support. So we often choose people to work with who are at a place where they've figured out, like, my passion is this is what I want to do, this is what I want to share, but might not have access to all of the resources that they need to be able to take that thing and move it forward in a really significant way. So we're now in our second season of that project, and we'll be having a premiere at the Plaza Theatre May 16, which is where we'll be like sharing all of the stories about the 6 incredible women that we're profiling and working with this year. And these are like, they're just the things they do and like the magic they bring. It's also varied and unique. Like, one of the cast that we're working with this year is a roller skater. Another one's a burlesque dancer. And many of them occupy like, multiple kinds of, roles in their professional lives. But it's a beautiful opportunity as well for us to really be able to center, Black and women of color in a radical way. Because I think for many of us, and I speak from a place of personal experience here, I think, we may have grown up in settings where we weren't centered, or, we felt like maybe we were the only, and they're possibly even today in a lot of contexts still experiencing that feeling in that boardroom or in that meeting of being the only, right? And so a big part of this project is also developing a sense of community and a network, and allowing us to be able to come to spaces where, we are connecting with others that are, have really different identities and experience to us, but also some really similar ones as well. So very excited for this project, and people can find out more about it at Humainologie. Best to follow us on Instagram, and it's Humainologie. It's like a tough one to spell, but and also at humainologie.com through our website.
Amazing. And I will be including the links in our show notes description. So thank you for all that you're doing through your projects and through Humainologie. And like, I so appreciate all the wisdom that you shared in our conversation, but also like the realness behind the two sides of most of the stories that we maybe don't often think about, right? So again, thank you, Salima, for your time and just you sharing your story. And then to everyone else who's tuned in to another episode, I appreciate you and your time, and I can't wait to stay connected with you on the next episode. Till then, stay safe.